Before there were books beside the bed, there were marks pressed into clay. As for now, let us begin our relaxing journey into paper, ink, and the quiet history of writing. Writing begins in a more useful place than a library. It begins wherever memory is too fragile for the work people need it to do. Picture a quiet storehouse near the edge of an early city. Barley is coming in. Oil jars are being counted. Sheep have been assigned to a household, a temple, a worker, or a field. The day itself may be ordinary, but the problem is serious. Once the goods move, how will anyone remember exactly what changed hands? Before writing became poetry, scripture, philosophy, letters, libraries, contracts, recipes, and bedtime books, it was very often something simpler and more practical. And memory, even a careful memory, can only hold so much. A spoken promise can disappear into the air. A number remembered by one person can be questioned by another. A pile of goods can change hands, and the moment of counting can pass. So people needed marks that could remain after the voice was quiet. They needed objects that could say, silently, this much was counted, this much was received, this much belonged here. That is one of the peaceful little truths at the beginning of writing. It did not have to begin as a grand announcement. It could begin as a mark beside a quantity, a sign impressed into damp clay. A simple shape that meant grain or sheep or fish or a person or a place. Writing let a thought rest outside the mind. It let a number sleep in clay. It let a name remain where a voice had been. And from that very ordinary need, from the need to count and remember, people slowly built one of the great quiet technologies of human life, the written surface. At first, that surface did not have to be paper. In many places, it could not have been paper, because paper had not yet arrived. People used what their worlds gave them. In Mesopotamia, with its rivers and silt and reed beds, clay and reeds became a natural pair. In Egypt, the papyrus plant grew along the Nile and became a writing surface of remarkable importance. Elsewhere, people wrote on stone, wood, bone, metal, wax, bark, leather, and later parchment. Each material shaped the way writing felt. Clay was heavy and patient. It could be held in the palm, pressed with a stylus, dried in the sun, or fired harder by accident or intention. Papyrus was light and rollable, made from a river plant, able to carry columns of ink. Parchment had the quiet strength of prepared animal skin. Paper, when it spread, could be light, foldable, absorbent, cheaper in many settings, and eventually so common that it almost disappeared into ordinary life. We will come to paper soon, but first we need to sit for a while with clay, because before there were books beside the bed, before there were shelves, pages, bookmarks, printed margins, notebooks, envelopes, and libraries full of sleeping words, there were small tablets of damp earth. In southern Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the land could produce an enormous amount of mud. That may sound like a humble beginning for writing, but it was exactly the kind of humble beginning that could last. Clay was available, clay could be shaped. Clay could be smoothed into a small tablet and marked while wet. If the record was temporary, it might dry and eventually break down. If the record mattered, or if fire hardened it later, a clay tablet could survive for thousands of years. So when we talk about the earliest writing in southern Mesopotamia, we are not only talking about signs, we are also talking about a landscape. We are talking about reed beds, river mud, storehouses, temple economies, workers, animals, grain, and the slow growth of towns and cities. We are talking about people whose lives depended on seasonal labor, food storage, water management, and administration. Writing did not float above that world, it grew out of it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art describes some of the earliest proto-cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia as dating to around 3100 to 2900 BC. These tablets were not yet literature in the later sense. Many were administrative. They recorded practical information, goods, quantities, officials, and transactions. The earliest signs were often pictographic. A mark might resemble what it meant: a head, a jar, a fish, a container, a kind of animal. Over time, the system became more abstract. The signs were turned, simplified, combined, and pressed into wet clay with the end of a reed or wooden stylus. This shift matters because the tool changed the look of thought. When a scribe drew a sign, the sign could keep a little of the shape of the thing it represented. But when a scribe pressed a stylus into clay, the mark took on the wedge-shaped form that gives cuneiform its modern name. The Latin roots of the word point to the wedge. A written sign became a set of small impressions, angled, neat, repeated, and quiet. If you imagine the sound of that work, it is not loud. It is the soft pressure of a stylus into damp clay, the tablet resting in one hand, the other hand moving carefully, the room perhaps warm, the air may be smelling faintly of earth, reeds, animals, and stored grain. A small tablet might record something very ordinary: so much barley, so many sheep, so many jars, so many workers, so many measures assigned to a person or place. The great thing about such ordinary records is that they remind us writing was not only made for kings and myths. It was also made for keeping track of what a community needed to survive. It was made for counting work and food. It was made for the material life of people who had to wake up, move goods, make decisions, and remember. According to the Met's summary of early writing, some early signs also show the rebus principle between about 3200 and 3000 BC. That means a sign could begin to be used not only for the object it pictured, but for sound. This is one of the great turning points. A mark could begin to move from thing to word, from picture to sound, from object to language. That did not happen all at once. It was gradual, and gradual is one of the most important words in this whole story. Writing did not simply appear as a finished invention. Paper did not appear as a single magical sheet. Books did not arrive complete with pages, covers, indexes, margins, and quiet reading lamps. Each piece came through experimentation, habit, trade, craft, and need. By after about 2600 BC, the Met notes that cuneiform texts show more consistent use of phonetic writing. And by the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, cuneiform was being used across many kinds of life: economic, religious, political, literary, and scholarly. That is a beautiful expansion. Something that began with counting and administration could also carry prayer, law, story, omen, song, and learning. The wet clay tablet became a place where thought could thicken and stay. Still, we should not picture this as a world where everyone wrote. Literacy was specialized. Scribes had training. Writing belonged to institutions, households, palaces, temples, and administrative systems in ways that varied by period and place. For many people, written marks were part of the world around them, but not necessarily something they personally made or read. That detail is important because it keeps the past honest. A clay tablet can be intimate in the hand, but writing was also power. If you could count, record, preserve, and retrieve information, you could organize labor, taxes, supplies, laws, and memory. Writing gave stillness to a fact, but it could also give authority to whoever controlled the written record. And yet, when we look closely at the object itself, there is something almost tender about it. A lump of earth was shaped into a small surface. A reed from a riverbank became a tool. A hand made marks. The marks dried. The day ended. The person who made them disappeared into time, but the marks remained. Not always whole, not always easy to read, sometimes broken, sometimes burned, sometimes buried beneath city layers and dust. But still there is a kind of sleep in that. The tablet slept in the ground. The words slept in the tablet. And thousands of years later, someone could lift it again and see the pressure of a hand that had been gone for longer than most nations have existed. That is one reason the history of writing is so good for quiet listening. It moves slowly. It asks us to pay attention to surfaces. Clay, reed, fiber, hide, rag, wood pulp, ink. It reminds us that the mind does not always need to rush. Sometimes it only needs a place to rest. In Mesopotamia, one of those first resting places was clay. And in Egypt, another was a plant that grew by the river. Papyrus begins in water. Before it was a scroll, before it was a surface for ink, before it carried accounts, letters, hymns, stories, legal texts, medical writing, and the careful work of scribes, papyrus was a plant growing in the wetlands of the Nile. The image is worth holding in the mind for a moment. Tall green stems rising from shallow water, sun on the river, birds moving over reeds, people cutting, carrying, bundling, sorting, and turning plant matter into something a hand could write on. In ancient Egypt, papyrus was more than a writing material. It was useful in many forms of ordinary life. The plant could be part of baskets, rope, sandals, mats, and boats. But when prepared as a writing surface, it became one of the most important materials in the history of records and books. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that the earliest known papyrus roll comes from the Dynasty I tomb of Hemaka at Saqqara, around 2900 BC. That earliest roll is blank, which is a wonderfully quiet detail. The oldest known roll is not a dramatic message. It is a prepared surface, silent and empty, a place where writing could have been. The earliest preserved text examples on papyrus, according to the Met, are administrative documents from Wadi al-Jarf, dating to Dynasty IV, around 2500 BC. Once again, the oldest surviving evidence pulls us back into everyday systems, accounts, records, and the practical movement of goods and labor. Papyrus, like clay, reminds us that writing surfaces were not only about great speeches, they were also about keeping a society awake to its own details. How exactly ancient Egyptians made papyrus is a subject that must be treated with care. The Met and Getty both warn us in different ways that the ancient process is not fully documented by Egyptian sources. The earliest known written description of papyrus making comes much later, from Pliny the Elder, around AD 77 to 79. So we should not pretend to stand inside an Old Kingdom workshop with perfect certainty. But the broad process can be described cautiously. The pith inside the papyrus stem was cut into strips. Those strips were laid in layers, often with one layer running one direction and a second layer running across it. The layers were pressed, dried, and smoothed until they formed a sheet. Sheets could then be joined into rolls. There is something restful about that process. Strips laid beside strips, fibers pressed into contact, water leaving slowly, the surface becoming pale, smooth, and ready. Clay received impressions. Papyrus received ink. And that changed the feeling of writing. Instead of pushing a sign into a soft tablet, a scribe could draw a line across a surface. The movement could be lighter, more fluid. The hand could make curves. A roll could carry columns of text. It could be stored, carried, opened, and read in sequence. Papyrus also had a direction. The fibers in the sheet made a subtle grain, and ancient sheets were often joined so the writing side used the horizontal fibers. This made the surface more comfortable for moving a brush or reed pen across the page. The tools of the scribe were small and deliberate: a palette, ink cakes or wells, brushes or reed pens, water, a roll or sheet. Black ink was used for much of the main writing. Red ink could mark headings, divisions, names, corrections, or emphasis, depending on the text and context. The Met describes Egyptian scribal kits using carbon-based black ink and red ink made with hematite, an iron oxide mineral. That detail gives us a simple palette for the imagination. Black from burned material, red from the earth. Writing, in this world, becomes a meeting of elements: water, plant, mineral, soot, hand, breath, and time. Papyrus was lighter than clay, and that lightness mattered. It could move. It could become correspondence. It could become an archive. It could carry a long text without becoming a crate full of tablets. A papyrus roll could be unrolled gradually, the words appearing in order, almost like a path. The form shaped the act of reading. To read a roll, one hand might unroll while the other gathered up what had already been read. The reader did not see the whole object like an open modern book. The text passed by in sections. Reading became a controlled unfolding. That is a beautiful physical metaphor. Thought does not always arrive all at once. Sometimes it unrolls. Sometimes it gives itself to us slowly, column by column. Papyrus remained important for a very long time. The Met describes it as being used for about 4,000 years, continuing into the 11th century AD. Over that long span, many other writing materials rose around it. Parchment became important. Paper eventually spread. Books changed shape. Yet papyrus held its place in the story because it showed how a plant from a river could become a vehicle for memory. If clay gave writing weight, papyrus gave writing movement. And once ink moved across papyrus, the human relationship with the written line changed again. Ink is easy to overlook because it seems small. We notice the tablet. We notice the page. We notice the book. We notice the library shelf. But ink is the dark path thought takes when it leaves the hand. Ink is the trace. It is the part of writing that remains after motion has stopped. In ancient Egyptian scribal practice, black and red inks were central tools. The Met describes black ink as carbon-based, made from soot or burned vegetable matter, and red ink is made from hematite, an iron oxide mineral. Even without a modern bottle, the basic idea is wonderfully direct. Collect a colored substance, bind it so it will move, and place it on a prepared surface. We should not turn that into a recipe. We do not need to. For a sleepy history, the important thing is the material poetry of it. Smoke becomes black. Earth becomes red. Water wakes the ink. A brush or reed carries it. A page receives it. And then the mark dries. The scribe's palette was a small world of order. The black and red colors had their places. The writing tool had its place. The water had its place. A roll could be opened, a line begun, and the hand could move with training that took years to acquire. It used the wrist, the eyes, the breath, the back, the posture, the patience of sitting. It asked the hand to repeat controlled forms again and again, until the signs were not only remembered, but embodied. This is true across many writing cultures. A writing system is not only a list of marks, it is a set of habits in the body. A scribe learns how hard to press, how much ink to carry, how wide a line should be, how to leave space, how to correct, how to make the next sign before the previous one has fully disappeared from attention. And writing tools create their own kinds of silence. The scratch of reed on papyrus, the slight tap of stylus against clay, the dry whisper of parchment under a quill, the faint drag of a pen across paper. Every material has a sound. Every tool asks for a different kind of attention. Ink also teaches us that writing is chemical, though in a quiet way. A mark is not only a shape, it is a material event. Something dark sits on or in a surface. It may fade, it may flake, it may bleed, it may sink into fibers, it may corrode the sheet, it may survive by luck in a dry climate, or disappear because water, mold, insects, fire, or time found it first. That is why the survival of ancient writing is never automatic. We have what we have because some things lasted and many things did not. Clay could survive where papyrus would vanish. Papyrus could survive in dry Egyptian conditions where it might decay elsewhere. Parchment could endure in some libraries and fall apart in others. Paper could be strong when made from good rag fibers and fragile when made from acidic wood pulp. The history of writing is therefore also the history of loss. For every surviving tablet, roll, codex, and notebook, there were countless written things that vanished. Shopping lists, letters, lessons, drafts, accounts, names, receipts, little notes that mattered for a day and then disappeared. That may sound sad, but it can also feel gentle. Not every written thing was meant to last forever. Some writing belonged to the day that needed it. Some marks helped a person remember one task, one payment, one message, one delivery, one correction, one thought before sleep. Writing can be permanent, but it can also be ordinary. That ordinary quality will follow us through the whole story, because even when we reach great libraries, golden manuscripts, printed Bibles, paper mills, and modern notebooks, the heart of the subject remains simple: a surface, a mark, a mind trying to leave something where it can be found again. Before bookshelves, there could be tablet rooms. Before paper libraries, there could be collections of clay. And one of the most famous ancient collections belonged to Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, in the 7th century BC. His library at Nineveh is not a library in the modern public sense. It was royal, scholarly, and institutional, tied to palace power and elite learning. But it remains one of the great examples of how seriously ancient people could take the gathering of written knowledge. The British Museum describes Ashurbanipal's library as containing more than 30,000 clay tablets and fragments. That number is important because it gives us scale, but the word fragments is just as important. What survives is not a neat room waiting on shelves. It is broken material, excavated and studied, with pieces that have to be understood, joined, translated, and interpreted. This is another quiet lesson of writing. Sometimes the past speaks in fragments. A broken tablet can still carry a line. A line can still carry a word. A word can still open a world. Ashurbanipal's collection included scholarly texts, literary works, omen texts, lexical lists, medical and ritual material, and other forms of learned writing. The point is not only that one famous library existed, but that ancient writing could gather many forms of thought into one royal and scholarly collection. For now, what matters is the idea of the clay library itself. Imagine a room where knowledge is heavy, not pages fluttering, not thin paper stacked in quires, but tablets, baked, dried, rectangular, sometimes small enough to fit in a palm, sometimes larger, sometimes written on more than one side, each one an object, each one with weight, each one requiring storage, handling, classification, and memory. A modern book can sit quietly on a shelf. A clay tablet sits with a different kind of authority. It feels geological. It feels closer to the earth. To write on clay is to ask the ground to remember. And yet, the intellectual world inside those tablets could be astonishingly abstract. Lists of words, signs and meanings, omens and observations, ritual knowledge, royal inscriptions, literature. The clay did not limit the mind to clay-like things. It carried imagination, fear, law, medicine, gods, kings, grammar, and story. That contrast is beautiful. Earth holding thought, mud holding language, a palace collecting signs. For a sleepy listener, this is also a reminder that libraries are not only rooms. A library is a decision to preserve. A library is a gathering of things that might otherwise drift apart. A library says, these words should stay near one another. These records should be kept. This knowledge should have a place to sleep until someone wakes it. Ashurbanipal's library was not gentle in every historical sense. It belonged to empire, conquest, and royal ambition. But even inside that harder world, the act of collecting written knowledge tells us something about the human hunger to hold on to thought. The same impulse appears again and again. In temple archives, in palace storerooms, in scroll collections, in monastic libraries, in university libraries, in family boxes of letters, in journals tucked beside beds. In notebooks filled halfway and then saved for years, writing makes memory portable, but libraries make memory gather. And once memory gathers, it changes the feeling of time. A person can enter a library and stand near minds that never met one another. A scribe in one century, a scholar in another, a reader in another, a conservator in another. The material object becomes a bridge. The bridge may be clay, it may be papyrus, it may be parchment, it may be paper. But the longing is familiar, to keep a thought long enough for someone else to find it. From the clay libraries of the ancient Near East, we can now move toward another material surface, one that would shape books for centuries. Parchment. Before the page turn, there was the unrolling. A scroll has a different rhythm from a book. It opens sideways through time. One hand gives the text forward, while the other gathers what has already passed. The reader does not simply flip to a page. The reader travels along the length of the roll. That can be beautiful. It can feel ceremonial. It can make reading into a slow unfolding. But a codex changed the body of reading. Getty defines a codex as a manuscript, usually handwritten, bound in book form. In plain language, it is the ancestor of the book shape most people recognize today. Pages attached along one side, opening and closing between covers. That change may sound ordinary because we live with books after the change already happened. But imagine the first experience of it. Instead of unrolling a long strip, you open a stack of folded leaves. Instead of moving through one continuous roll, you can turn. Instead of searching by unrolling and re-rolling, you can move more directly to a section. Instead of carrying a long tube, you can carry a compact block of pages. The British Library describes a broad transition in the Greco-Roman world over the first few centuries AD. In the early 1st century, books were commonly papyrus rolls. By late antiquity, the majority of books were being produced as codices, and parchment had become the writing support of choice. That is a long transition, not a switch thrown in a single year. Early book history is full of gradual changes like this. The roll does not vanish the moment the codex appears. Papyrus does not vanish the moment parchment becomes important. Parchment does not vanish the moment paper spreads. Handwriting does not vanish the moment printing expands. Older and newer forms live beside one another for a long time. That overlap is important because it keeps the past from becoming too tidy. Real history is rarely tidy. It is layered. A person in one place might use an old form, while another place adopts a new one. A religious community might prefer one format. A bureaucracy might prefer another. A traveler might choose a portable notebook. A library might keep scrolls and codices in the same broad world of texts. The British Library discusses a small fragment known as Papyrus 745, or P-Oxy I-30, generally dated to the late 1st or early 2nd century AD. It is tiny, roughly 2/3 the size of an average smartphone, and is described by the British Library as the earliest Latin codex in existence. Even here, the source is careful. Dating ancient scripts precisely is difficult, and a fragment does not tell us everything about the original book. That caution is part of good historical sleep. We do not need to force certainty where the evidence is modest. Sometimes a fragment is enough to open a door, but not enough to furnish the whole room. The codex mattered because it changed access inside a text. A book with pages lets the reader return, compare, mark, and find. It supports tables, indexes, cross-references, marginal notes, and a different relationship between text and hand. The page number later becomes a kind of address. A passage has a location that can be shared. Turn to this page. Look at this column. Find this chapter. See the note in the margin. The codex made the written object more navigable. It also made it more intimate. A roll can feel formal and extended. A codex can feel close to the body. It can be held open in the hands. It can rest on the lap. It can be closed with a finger holding a place. It can lie beside a bed. The page turn becomes one of the most familiar small gestures in intellectual life. Not dramatic, not loud. Just the hand moving the leaf from right to left or left to right, depending on the writing tradition and binding. One surface ends, another begins. The codex also deepened the relationship between front and back. Pages had two sides. A reader could move through recto and verso, leaf after leaf. The book gained thickness. Progress became visible. You could feel how much had been read and how much remained. This physical sense of progress may be one reason books are so satisfying. The mind moves through text, and the hand feels the movement as weight shifting from one side to the other. At the beginning, most of the book is ahead. In the middle, the hands balance. Near the end, the remaining pages grow thin. The body knows where it is. Screens can show progress bars, but a book gives progress to the fingers. The codex did not only change reading, it changed storage. Books could be stacked, shelved, labeled, chained, carried, opened on desks, and protected by covers. Their edges could be trimmed, their leaves could be gathered in quires, their bindings could be repaired. In other words, the codex made writing more book-like in the full material sense. That may sound obvious, but it took time for the form to become normal. And once it did, it shaped expectations for centuries. When many people imagine reading, they still imagine a codex, a bound block of pages, opening in the hands, holding words in order. That quiet form sits between the scroll and the modern book. It connects papyrus, parchment, and paper. It makes the next stage of our story easier to understand, because parchment did not only give people a durable writing surface, it gave the codex a strong body. So now we can move more fully into parchment. Animal hide prepared, scraped, stretched, and turned into memory. Parchment begins with skin. That is not always the first thing we imagine when we see a beautiful medieval manuscript. We may notice the script, the gold, the painted border, the careful initials, or the sense of quiet ceremony on the page. But beneath all of that beauty is a prepared animal hide. Parchment is not paper. It is not papyrus. It is not leather in the usual sense either. The Metropolitan Museum of Art explains that parchment is made from animal skin. But unlike leather, it is not tanned. The hide is cleaned, stretched, scraped, and dried under tension. That process changes it into a writing surface, firm, pale, durable, and responsive to ink and paint. There's a great deal of labor hidden in a parchment page. An animal had to be raised, the hide had to be prepared, hair and flesh had to be removed, the skin had to be stretched on a frame. The maker had to scrape it carefully, thinning and smoothing it without tearing it. Then, after drying, the surface could be cut, folded, ruled, written, decorated, sewn, and bound. A finished manuscript page might look calm, but it is the end of many motions: scraping, stretching, smoothing, folding, pricking, ruling, writing, painting, binding. Parchment also has two sides. One side is usually called the hair side, the other the flesh side. Skilled makers and scribes understood the differences in texture and appearance. In some manuscripts, the alternation of sides can still be seen, quietly reminding the reader that the book was once a living material, transformed by craft. This can feel strange to a modern reader used to paper as an ordinary office object. Paper is so common now that it can feel almost weightless in meaning. A receipt, a form, a grocery list, a page from a printer. But parchment was costly. It required animals, labor, tools, and time. A large book could require many skins. The material itself carried value before a single word was written. That value shaped the way people used it. A parchment manuscript was not casual in the way a modern notepad can be casual. It could be repaired. It could be scraped and reused in some cases. It could be folded into gatherings, sewn into codices, and preserved in libraries. It could hold sacred texts, legal records, literature, music, science, medicine, and administrative writing. A codex is a book form with pages bound along one side, more like the books we know today than a scroll. Papyrus could be used in codex form too, and the story of the codex is complex. But parchment became especially important for the manuscript book. It could fold well, it could be written on both sides, it could endure frequent handling. The feeling of reading changed again. With a scroll, text unfolds. With a codex, text opens. A reader can turn pages. A reader can move backward and forward more easily. A passage can be found again. Leaves can be numbered. Margins can hold notes. The body can sit with the book in a different way. There is a deep comfort in the page turn. One surface disappears, another arrives. The hand participates in the rhythm of thought. Parchment also teaches us that writing materials are never neutral. The surface determines what is possible. It affects cost, speed, storage, durability, and access. A society that depends on expensive parchment has a different relationship to writing than a society with abundant cheap paper. The Met notes that paper did not become widely used in Europe until the 12th century AD. That does not mean Europe had no writing before then, of course. It means that parchment held a central role in manuscript culture before paper became common enough to transform habits. The date matters because it keeps us from collapsing the whole past into one imaginary desk. We should not picture a 6th century monastery with modern paper notebooks. We should not picture early medieval scribes using cheap stacks of office paper. The materials were different, and the difference shaped the world. A parchment page could be precious, and because it was precious, the work around it could become highly deliberate. Lines might be ruled before writing, margins planned, initial letters left for decoration, corrections inserted, gatherings arranged, bindings added. The book was not only text, it was architecture. It had structure, it had sequence, it had weight, it had a cover eventually, and a spine, and boards, and sometimes clasps. The book became an object that could close around thought. There is something peaceful about that. The written mind being folded into a form that can be held. A page protected between covers. A text waiting in darkness until a hand opens it again. Parchment carries a kind of moonlit feeling in the imagination. Pale surfaces, dark ink, quiet rooms, slow work. But it is also a material of animals, knives, water, frames, scraped fibers, and human skill. It is not magical, it is crafted, and that may be more beautiful. Because a crafted page reminds us that memory does not preserve itself, someone has to prepare a place for it. That is true of parchment, and it will be true in another way of paper. Paper is one of those inventions that can sound simple only because we live after it. A thin sheet made from fibers, soft enough to fold, strong enough to write on, light enough to carry, cheap enough eventually to fill schools, offices, libraries, kitchens, pockets, boxes, envelopes, and bedside tables. But paper was not inevitable. It required people to understand fibers, water, pulp, molds, pressing, drying, smoothing, and the strange transformation by which torn and soaked material becomes a new flat surface. The history of paper in China is often connected with Cai Lun, an official of the Han court, who is credited in textual sources with presenting or improving paper in AD 105. That date is useful, and we can say it. The International Dunhuang program, connected with the British Library, notes the traditional credit to Cai Lun, while also describing scholarship and evidence that paper existed before AD 105. In other words, Cai Lun is important in the written tradition, but he should not be treated as the single certain inventor of paper from nothing. That careful distinction matters. It keeps the story honest. It also makes the story more interesting. Instead of one person suddenly inventing a perfect sheet, we can imagine a longer world of experiment. Old rags, hemp, ramie, bark fibers, ropes, nets, soaking, beating, straining, drying, and improving. Paper emerges not as a lightning bolt, but as a patient craft. That is very much in keeping with the rest of the history. Clay tablets developed slowly. Papyrus was prepared through craft. Parchment required trained labor. Paper, too, was a material art. The Library of Congress notes that paper was invented in China and came into wide use there by the 3rd century AD. This wide use is significant because a material only changes society when it becomes part of routine. A rare sheet can be impressive. A common enough sheet can alter learning, administration, religion, trade, poetry, memory, and bureaucracy. Paper had advantages. Compared with clay, it was light. Compared with papyrus, it could be made from a wider range of fibers and could fit different climates and systems of production. Compared with parchment, it could often be cheaper and easier to multiply, especially once workshops and mills developed. But again, we should not make the story too simple. Paper quality varied. Paper could be fragile or strong. It could be sized, polished, dyed, burnished, folded, pasted, printed, repaired, eaten by insects, damaged by water, or preserved for centuries. Like every writing surface, it had a life. Picture a paper workshop. Fibers soaking, water cloudy with pulp, a screen or mold lifted through the vat, a wet sheet forming like a pale skin on the surface, the water draining away, the sheet pressed. The sheet dried, one page becoming possible, then another, then another. There is something almost meditative in paper making. The same motions repeat, but each sheet is still slightly individual. The maker feels the thickness of pulp, the rhythm of lifting and draining, the patience of drying, the judgment of touch. In a sleepy history, paper is a beautiful object because it sits between strength and softness. It can tear, it can burn, it can wrinkle in damp air. It can be lost in a single spilled cup. And yet, paper has carried empires, poems, maps, sutras, letters, drawings, account books, recipes, notebooks, children's lessons, and the private thoughts of people who never expected strangers to read them centuries later. Paper is fragile, but civilization trusted it. That trust is astonishing. We trusted thin sheets to carry laws. We trusted them to carry love letters. We trusted them to carry prayers. We trusted them to carry music. We trusted them to carry the names of the dead. And because paper was portable, it helped thoughts move. Paper could travel in bundles, in scrolls, in codices, in letters, in wrapped packets, in archives, in monasteries, in courts, in markets, in schools, and eventually in trains, ships, mailbags, desks, and drawers. The history of paper is therefore also a history of motion. But at night, when a sheet lies still on a desk, it feels like quiet. Empty paper is a kind of invitation. It asks for a mark, but it does not demand one. It can wait. The blank page is patient, and that patience may be one reason paper has such a strong hold on the imagination. It gives thought a place to arrive slowly. Paper did not remain only where it began. Like many powerful technologies, it traveled through people. Merchants, monks, officials, artisans, soldiers, translators, scholars, migrants, and craftsmen, whose names are often lost. It moved along routes of trade and conquest, through Central Asia and into the Islamic world, and eventually into Europe. We have to be careful with the travel story. A common simplified version ties paper's westward spread to a single battle and a single group of captured craftsmen. That story appears often, but the transmission of paper was broader and more complicated than one event. For our purposes, it is better to say that paper moved through networks over time, with craft knowledge carried by people and adopted in new places. The Metropolitan Museum of Art notes that by around the 8th century AD, paper became the most popular writing material in the Arab world. That single fact opens a very wide door. Paper supported scholarship. It supported administration. It supported copying. It supported poetry, science, religion, commerce, and correspondence. It helped make books easier to produce in some settings. It helped written culture expand because sheets could be made, prepared, and used in large quantities. In Islamic book arts, paper was not merely a neutral support. It could be prepared with care. It could be sized, polished, tinted, ruled, and decorated. Calligraphy became a central art. Ink, paper, geometry, illumination, and binding worked together. The Met's essay on the arts of the book in the Islamic world, focused especially on the period from 1600 to 1800, describes the richness of bookmaking materials and techniques. Paper preparation, inks, calligraphy, decoration, and the assembled craft of the manuscript page. That source is later than the first spread of paper, so we should use it for material process and artistry, not as evidence for the 8th century origin story. Dates must stay attached to the sources that support them. Still, the later manuscript traditions help us picture what paper could become once absorbed into an artistic and scholarly culture. Imagine a sheet being burnished until it gleams softly. Imagine the ruling lines prepared before writing. Imagine a calligrapher mixing ink and testing the pen. Imagine the page waiting, not blank in an empty sense, but prepared, awake, and ready. Paper changed as it moved. Local water changed it. Local tools changed it. Local tastes changed it. A sheet made in one place did not have to feel exactly like a sheet made in another. Some papers were thick, some thin, some smooth, some absorbent, some strong, some delicate, some tinted, some polished so the ink sat beautifully on the surface. Writing materials are local, even when the idea behind them is global. That is one of the calmer truths of material history. There is no abstract page. There is always this page, made somewhere, from something, by someone, for a purpose. And as paper traveled, it carried more than writing. It carried methods, it carried habits, it carried the possibility of copying and storing thought in new ways. A court with paper could keep records differently. A scholar with paper could copy more. A merchant with paper could write letters and accounts. A poet with paper could revise. The humble sheet widened the space between a thought and its disappearance. That is the heart of it. A thought arises and would vanish. Paper says, stay a while. Ink says, become visible. The hand says, I will try to shape you. And a reader, somewhere else sometime later, says, I found you. From the spread of paper, we can move into another revolution in repetition. printing. Writing fixes a single motion. Printing repeats it. That difference is simple, but it changes almost everything. When a scribe writes by hand, each copy is a new act. The hand returns to the beginning. The ink is dipped again. The line is remade. Mistakes can enter. Corrections can appear. The copy carries the body of the scribe inside it. Printing begins from a different dream. Make the surface once, ink it, press it, then use that prepared surface again, so the same words can travel into another copy. In East Asia, woodblock printing became a major way to multiply texts and images. A block could be carved with characters and designs in relief. Ink could be applied to the raised surface. Paper could be placed against it, rubbed or pressed, and lifted away with the text transferred. There's a very physical calm in that process. The carving of the block, the careful checking of the surface, the spreading of ink, the placement of paper, the smooth pressure of hand or tool, the lifting of the sheet. The appearance of another copy. One of the most famous surviving printed works is the Diamond Sutra, now associated with the British Library and the International Dunhuang Program. It is dated AD 868, and the IDP British Library describes it as the world's earliest dated printed book. That phrasing is important. Earliest dated printed book. Not the first printed thing ever, not the beginning of all printing, but a dated survival, a specific artifact that lets us anchor part of the story in AD 868. The Diamond Sutra reminds us that printed culture did not begin in Europe. It also reminds us that sacred, scholarly, and devotional traditions helped drive the copying and multiplying of texts. A printed scroll could carry words beyond the reach of one hand's writing, but woodblock printing still required a block for each page or section. The characters had to be carved into the block. If the text changed, the block did not simply rearrange itself. It was fixed. Movable type introduced another possibility. The Library of Congress, discussing the history of printing in Asia, notes that Bi Sheng invented movable type in China between AD 1041 and 1048. Movable type meant that individual characters or pieces could be arranged, inked, printed, and reused. Again, we should resist making this too simple. The usefulness of movable type depends on language, script, materials, labor, demand, and production systems. A technology can exist without immediately transforming everything around it, but the concept is still extraordinary. Writing broken into reusable pieces. Letters and characters become objects. Words become arrangements. A page becomes a temporary gathering of parts. Then the parts can scatter and gather again as something else. This is one of the quiet philosophical turns in the history of writing. A handwritten page feels like one continuous gesture. A printed page is assembled from repeatable forms. It has a mechanical rhythm, even when the final result is beautiful. Printing also changes the relationship between error and repetition. A scribe might make a different mistake on each copy. A printed block might reproduce the same error again and again. That can be a problem, but it can also help scholars identify additions, states, corrections, and lineages of printed texts. The page begins to carry clues about its own making. Every technology leaves traces. Clay leaves pressure marks. Papyrus leaves fibers. Parchment leaves the memory of skin. Paper leaves mold patterns, chain lines, watermarks, fibers, stains, and edges. Printing leaves type impressions, ink spread, broken letters, worn blocks, and repeated mistakes. To a patient reader, an old page is not only a text. It is a record of touch. It tells us how people worked. It tells us what tools they used. It tells us what they valued enough to copy. That is why the history of writing is also the history of surfaces being pressed, scratched, soaked, stretched, scraped, polished, folded, sewn, and read. The more we slow down, the more the page reveals. By the time printing developed in East Asia, Paper had already shown that a sheet could be both ordinary and powerful. Printing multiplied that power. It made the written surface more repeatable. It allowed a text to travel in copies that looked more alike than hand copies often could. And still, even a printed sheet required hands. Hands carved, hands inked, hands pressed, hands dried, hands folded, hands bound, hands carried. The machine, or the block, or the type, never removed the human body from the page. It changed the body's work. And while printed books grew in importance, handwritten manuscripts did not disappear overnight. In many places, manuscript culture remained rich, beautiful, and deeply valued. So before we move to the European printing press, let us sit for a little while in the quiet room of the manuscript maker. A medieval manuscript is a building made of pages. It has foundations. It has rooms of text. It has decorated thresholds where initials open a section. It has margins like quiet corridors. It has a cover like a door. And before it became a finished book, it passed through many kinds of hands. The Getty's materials on manuscript making describe a world where books were written, decorated, and bound by hand. Parchment had to be prepared, pages had to be arranged, lines had to be ruled, text had to be copied, decoration could be added, the gatherings had to be sewn, and boards and covers eventually made the object into a book. The word scriptorium often brings to mind rows of monks copying books in silence. That did happen in some settings, but we should not make one picture stand for every time and place. Manuscript production varied. It could happen in monasteries, urban workshops, royal and university settings, and other contexts depending on period and region. What remains constant is the labor. A page had to be prepared before it could be beautiful. Tiny holes might be pricked along the edge to guide ruling lines. Lines might be drawn so the writing stayed even. Spaces might be left for initials or illustrations. A scribe might copy carefully from an exemplar, keeping the eye moving between source and new page, source and new page. Imagine the mental rhythm. Read a phrase. Hold it. Write it. Return to the source. Find the place. Read the next phrase. Hold it. This is not fast work. It is repetitive, disciplined, and vulnerable to fatigue. A tired eye can skip from one repeated word to another. A hand can miss a line. A correction can be scraped, inserted, or marked. Even the mistakes are human. They remind us that books were not born perfect. They were made by bodies in time. Ink in a manuscript room was not just darkness on a page. It was pace. A line too wet could smear, a pen too dry could catch, a surface too rough could trouble the stroke. Good writing required coordination between material, tool, and hand. Then came decoration. Some manuscripts were plain and practical. Others were luxuriously illuminated, with gold, pigments, borders, figures, and ornament. The Getty and Smart History materials emphasize the range of materials involved. Parchment, ink, pigments, gold, wood, and binding structures. A book could be both a text and a costly object of devotion, prestige, learning, or law. Gold on a page changes light. It does not merely color the surface. It catches the lamp. It shifts as the reader moves. It makes the page respond to the room. That is an important part of pre-modern reading. The page was not seen under a uniform electric bulb. It might be read by daylight, candlelight, lamp flame, or the changing brightness near a window. The materials were alive to light. Gold flashed, ink softened, parchment warmed. Shadows moved in the fold. The codex form also shaped attention. Quires sewn together, boards protecting the text, a spine holding the body. A book could close, rest, and be carried. The manuscript book has a bodily quality. It asks to be held or supported. It has thickness. It has a smell. It has edges. It has the quiet resistance of material. In a digital world, it is easy to think of text as something floating. But for most of history, text had weight. It had grain. It had a temperature under the hand. It had a surface that could be damaged, repaired, stained, kissed, sworn upon, chained, hidden, or treasured. The slow making of manuscripts also reminds us that repetition can be sacred, or practical, or both. Copying a text was not only duplication, it was preservation. Each copy extended a text's chance of survival. That does not mean every copy was accurate. It does mean every copy was an act of continuation. A scribe sitting with a text participates in a chain. Someone wrote before, someone copies now, someone may read later. Writing becomes a relay of attention. This is one reason libraries feel so calming. They hold the results of repeated attention. Shelf after shelf is filled with things someone cared enough to preserve, copy, bind, print, collect, or catalog. The quiet of a library is not emptiness. It is stored effort. And as paper became more common in Europe from the 12th century AD onward, and as manuscript culture met expanding bureaucracies, universities, commerce, and eventually printing, the number of written objects continued to grow. The page was becoming more available, the world was becoming more recordable, and ink would have to keep up. Some inks sit on the page like soot. Some inks become part of the page more aggressively. Iron gall ink is one of the great writing inks of Western history, and it is also one of the most complicated. It could produce a rich, dark line. It flowed well from quills and later pens. It was used for centuries, but it could also damage the very paper or parchment it was meant to preserve. The Library of Congress describes iron gall ink as the primary Western writing ink from the 12th through the 19th centuries. That is a remarkable span of time. Think about what that means. Legal records, letters, music, scientific notes, government documents, family papers, school exercises, private journals. For centuries, many written thoughts traveled through some version of this dark liquid. The common ingredients, described by the Library of Congress, included oak galls, iron sulfate, water, and gum arabic. Again, we are not giving a recipe. We are only understanding the material family. Oak galls are growths formed on oak trees, often through the activity of insects. They contain tannins. When those tannins meet iron salts, a dark compound forms. Gum arabic helps the ink flow and bind. Water carries it. A forest, a mineral, a tree resin, and a hand. At first, iron gall ink could look pale or grayish when applied, then darken as chemistry worked. On the page, the line could become strong and brown-black. In many manuscripts and documents, the color now varies with age, sometimes warm brown, sometimes nearly black, sometimes faded, sometimes surrounded by damage. The trouble comes from the same chemistry that made the ink so useful. Iron gall ink can become acidic and corrosive. Over time, especially under poor storage conditions, it can eat into paper or parchment. Letters can crack through the page, lines can become holes, a document can be wounded by its own writing. There's a strange philosophy in that. The ink that preserves can also destroy. The mark that saves memory can weaken the surface carrying it. A thought wants to last, but the materials of lasting are never perfect. Conservators who work with iron gall ink do not only read texts. They study deterioration, they stabilize, they decide how much handling is safe. They examine fibers, acidity, humidity, and light. Preservation becomes a second act of care after writing. The writer made the mark. The conservator helps the mark survive. Centuries may pass between those two gestures. Iron gall ink is also a reminder that old documents are not simply old words. They are chemical objects. They are environments. They have reacted with air, water, light, storage, dust, insects, human hands, and their own ingredients. An archive is therefore not just a room of information. It is a room of materials slowly changing. That slow change is one of the quietest forms of history. You cannot hear paper acidify. You cannot hear ink corrode. You cannot hear fibers weaken. But time is moving through the object all the same. For a sleepy listener, perhaps that can become soothing rather than alarming. Everything material is changing. Even the page, even the ink, even the book. And yet with care, many things last long enough. Long enough for a letter to be read. Long enough for a poem to cross a century. Long enough for a tablet to be translated. Long enough for a manuscript to be opened again under soft light. Writing is never absolute permanence. It is a promise to try. From iron gall ink, we can now turn to the growing hunger for paper itself. The rags, vats, mills, machines, and fibers that slowly made paper part of everyday life. Before paper could become ordinary, it had to become repeatable. A single beautiful sheet is one thing. A steady supply is another. For centuries in the West, paper was commonly made from rags, worn linen and cotton cloth gathered, sorted, cleaned, broken down, and transformed into pulp. The Library of Congress notes that before the mid-19th century, Western paper was generally made from cotton and linen clothing rags, and that these rag papers tend to be stronger and more durable than later papers made from wood pulp. That detail is wonderfully domestic. Old shirts, old sheets, old linen. Cloth that had touched bodies, beds, tables, labor, weather, and washing could become pages. The life of fabric did not end when the garment wore out. It could be gathered by rag collectors, sorted by quality, soaked, beaten, pulped, and remade into sheets that might carry a letter, a ledger, a legal record, a map, or a book. Paper, in this sense, was a second life for cloth. There is a quiet circularity in that. A shirt becomes a page, a sheet becomes a letter. Human life turns into a surface for human thought. In a traditional paper-making workshop, the process could be wet, noisy, repetitive, and skilled. Rags were sorted and prepared. Fibers were broken down. The pulp was mixed with water in a vat. A mold and decal were dipped into the vat and lifted with just the right motion, catching a thin layer of fibers on a screen. Water drained away. The wet sheet was transferred, pressed, dried, sized, and finished. A good sheet required judgment. Too much pulp, and the sheet might be thick and uneven. Too little, and it might be weak. A poor lift could leave flaws. Bad drying could warp or stain. Even in repeated production, the hand mattered. Watermarks entered this world through the mold. A wire design attached to the mold could make the paper thinner in that shape. When held to light, the mark appeared like a pale ghost inside the sheet. Watermarks could identify a maker, a region, a size, a quality, or a batch. They are beautiful because they are not printed on the page. They are built into its body. The watermark is a secret made visible by light. This is one of the loveliest details in paper history. A page may look plain until you hold it up. Then a symbol appears. A hand, a crown, a bunch of grapes, a name, a mark of origin. The sheet remembers how it was made. Paper mills also changed the sound of writing history. The quiet page may have been born in a loud place. Water wheels, hammers, vats, workers calling, sheets pressed, stacks moved, drying lofts filled with pale surfaces. The written word often arrives to us in silence, but the materials behind it were full of work. That is true again and again. The library is quiet because the labor has already happened. The book is still because the workshop is gone. The page rests because many hands moved before it. As demand for paper increased, older hand processes struggled to supply the growing appetite for printed books, newspapers, forms, ledgers, letters, packaging, and bureaucracy. The history of paper became a history of scale. More schools, more offices, more laws, more bills, more books, more newspapers. More paper needed everywhere. The Robert C. Williams Museum of Papermaking at Georgia Tech describes an important shift toward machine papermaking. Nicolas Louis Robert invented a paper machine prototype in 1798. The patent was dated January 18, 1799, and improved machines were developed in England beginning in the early 19th century, with the Fourdrinier name becoming associated with continuous paper production. The idea of continuous paper is easy to miss, but it is enormous. Instead of lifting one sheet at a time by hand, a machine could form paper as a continuous web. Paper could move, drain, press, dry, and roll through a system. The sheet was no longer only a sheet. It became a stream. Paper began to flow. This is where the page starts to approach the modern world. Paper becomes industrial. It becomes abundant. It becomes cheap enough to waste, which is both convenient and sad. It becomes so common that people forget it is a technology. But even ordinary paper still carries the old story. Fiber suspended in water, water drained away, a surface formed, a mark made, thought resting on a sheet. By the 15th century, paper, ink, and movable type met in Europe in a way that changed the history of books. Johannes Gutenberg is not the beginning of printing in the world. That is important to say clearly. East Asian printing traditions came earlier, and we have already rested for a while with the Diamond Sutra of AD 868 and Bi Sheng's movable type of AD 1041 to 1048. But Gutenberg's work in Mainz became a major turning point in European printing. The Library of Congress describes the Gutenberg Bible as the first great book printed in Western Europe from movable metal type. Its copies were printed in Mainz in 1454 and 1455, with the work probably completed late in 1455, according to the library's resource guide. The dates give the story a firm place. 1454, 1455, Mainz, movable metal type, ink, press, paper, and vellum copies, a Bible that belonged to both manuscript culture and print culture at once. That last part is important. Gutenberg's Bible did not look like a cheap throwaway object. It was designed to resemble the prestigious manuscript books people already valued. The printed text could still be hand-finished. Rubrication, illumination, and binding remained part of the final object. In other words, the new technology entered the world wearing familiar clothes. That happens often. New media imitate old media before becoming fully themselves. The printed book borrowed the authority and beauty of the manuscript book. It kept columns, type styles, decoration, margins, and the expectation that a serious book should look worthy of attention. Movable metal type changed production because letters could be cast, arranged, inked, printed, taken apart, and used again. A page became a form locked into place. Ink was applied, the press brought pressure, sheets were printed, then the form could be changed for the next page. The process was mechanical, but not automatic in the modern sense. It still required skilled labor. Type had to be made, text had to be set, pages had to be imposed, ink had to be managed, paper had to be dampened or prepared depending on method. Sheets had to be hung or stacked. Errors had to be corrected. Printed sheets had to be gathered, folded, sewn, trimmed, and bound. The printing shop was not a magic box that produced books by itself. It was a coordinated room of tools and people. Still, the effect was profound. More copies could be made with greater consistency. Texts could circulate more widely. Ideas could travel faster. Standardization became more possible. Errors could spread too, but so could corrections, additions, commentary, and debate. Printing did not make the world instantly literate. It did not erase inequality. It did not make books available to everyone at once. But it altered the economics and pace of written culture in Europe. Imagine trying to feed a growing print culture entirely with parchment. The material would have been too costly and limited. Paper made print more practical. Print made paper more necessary. The two technologies strengthened one another. Ink also had to change. Printing ink needed different qualities from ordinary writing ink. It had to cling to type, transfer under pressure, and make a clear impression. Oil-based inks became important in European printing. The chemistry and craft of ink continued to adapt to the tool. That is one of the patterns in this whole history. When the surface changes, ink changes. When the tool changes, the page changes. When the page changes, reading changes. When reading changes, thought changes. The printed book became one of the defining objects of the modern world. But if we slow down, it is still made of simple things. Black marks, pale sheets, pressure, order, repetition, hands. A book can contain vast ideas, but physically it is humble. Plant fibers, cloth fibers, animal glue, ink, thread, boards, paper, leather, cloth, and time. And at night, when a book lies closed on a bedside table, all of that history becomes almost invisible. The whole long chain rests there quietly. There was a time when paper was valuable enough to save carefully. Then, slowly, paper became common enough to surround people. It filled offices. It filled schools. It filled newspapers. It filled drawers, desks, bags, mailboxes, shelves, archives, courts, kitchens, and shops. The shift was not only cultural. Rags could not supply an unlimited hunger for paper. There were only so many worn linen and cotton cloths to collect. As printing, literacy, commerce, administration, and newspapers expanded, the demand for paper grew beyond what traditional rag supply could easily satisfy. The Library of Congress explains that starting in the mid-19th century, wood replaced rags as the raw material for much paper manufacture. This made large-scale paper production possible, but it also brought preservation problems. Mechanical wood pulp paper contains lignin and shorter fibers, and it can become acidic and brittle over time. Many people have seen this without knowing the chemistry. An old newspaper turning yellow, a cheap paperback becoming brown at the edges, a book smelling sharp and dry. That is part of the story of wood pulp paper. Paper became cheaper and more abundant, but not always more durable. This is one of the great trades in material history. Access can increase while longevity decreases. More people can read today's news, while today's paper may not survive as gracefully as an older rag paper document. A sturdy sheet made from linen and cotton rags might last for centuries. A cheap acidic sheet might begin aging badly within decades. That does not make cheap paper unimportant. Quite the opposite. Cheap paper changed everyday life. It allowed people to write more, print more, advertise more, teach more, package more, file more, and communicate more. It supported newspapers, school books, catalogs, tickets, forms, notebooks, envelopes, posters, pamphlets, and personal letters. The paper flood could be overwhelming, but it was also democratic in some ways. A person did not need a luxury manuscript to hold text. A child could have a school notebook. A worker could have a printed form. A household could receive a newspaper. A shop could send an invoice. A traveler could carry a ticket. A family could keep letters in a box. Paper moved into the small routines of life. Morning newspaper, school assignment, shopping list, recipe card, letter from far away, envelope on the table, calendar on the wall, notebook by the bed. The great irony is that the more paper succeeded, the less people noticed it. A clay tablet feels ancient. A papyrus roll feels special. A parchment manuscript feels precious. A printed book can feel meaningful. But a plain sheet of paper can feel like nothing at all, until it matters, until it carries a signature, until it holds a letter from someone gone, until it contains a child's drawing, until it preserves a recipe in a grandmother's handwriting. Until it marks a birth, a marriage, a deed, a map, a poem, a promise, a confession, or a goodbye. Paper is ordinary right up to the moment it becomes sacred to someone. That is why the history of paper is never only industrial. It is intimate. Paper touches the scale of nations and the scale of a single pocket. It can carry a constitution or a grocery list. It can hold a treaty or a bedtime note. It can be archived behind glass or folded and forgotten in a drawer. And even now, when so much writing lives on screens, paper keeps a particular emotional weight. A handwritten note feels different from a typed message. A book feels different from a file. A journal feels different from an app. That difference is not only nostalgia, it comes from the body. Paper lets the hand be seen. Pressure, slant, hesitation, ink flow, crossings out, margins, smudges, folds, stains. The page remembers contact. A written page is not always alone. Sometimes it is a loose sheet on a desk. Sometimes it is a letter folded into itself. Sometimes it is rolled, stacked, tied, sealed, filed, or hidden. And sometimes it is gathered with other pages until it becomes a book. Bookbinding is easy to overlook because a good binding does its work quietly. It holds pages in order. It protects them. It lets the reader open and close the text. It gives the book a body. But binding is a technology of memory just as much as ink or paper. Without binding, sheets drift. A book is a community of pages. The Getty's manuscript materials describe the making of medieval books as a sequence of hand processes: preparing parchment, writing, painting, and binding. The University of Nottingham's guidance on medieval binding describes gatherings or choirs being assembled in the correct order before sewing and binding. It also notes that by the 12th century, scribes could use catchwords, the first few words of the next gathering written at the bottom right of the previous one, helping the binder place the parts in order. That little detail is wonderfully practical. A catchword is not usually the glamorous part of a manuscript. It is not gold. It is not a painted saint. It is not a grand initial. It is a small housekeeping mark for the future of the book. It says quietly, "The next piece begins here." This is the kind of detail that makes book history feel human. People working with loose gatherings needed systems. They needed reminders. They needed ways to prevent error. A book is not just written, it is managed into existence. Think of the stages: sheets folded, gatherings nested, order checked, sewing stations prepared, thread drawn through folded leaves, covers attached, boards shaped, leather, cloth, or other covering applied. The book slowly becoming an object that can survive repeated touch. When we hold a book, we often think of the author first. That is natural. But many books also contain the labor of paper makers, parchment makers, ink makers, scribes, typesetters, printers, illustrators, binders, booksellers, librarians, conservators, and readers. The author writes the words, but the book is made by a village of skills. Even in a modest printed book, binding matters. Pages must stay together. The spine must flex. The cover must protect. The object has to endure opening, closing, shelving, travel, damp, dry air, heat, dust, and careless hands. The Library of Congress has described book construction as a visible technical history. From papyrus to parchment to paper, and from Gutenberg's Bible to the pulp paperback. That phrase, book construction, is useful because it reminds us that books are built. They are engineered at the scale of the hand. A book has hinges, a spine, leaves, boards, thread, adhesive, cloth or leather, end papers, sometimes clasps, sometimes repairs, sometimes scars. The physical book tells its own story even before the words begin. Open an old book gently, and you may hear a small sound from the spine. You may smell paper, cloth, leather, dust, and age. You may feel the difference between thick and thin paper, between glossy and matte, between flexible and brittle. You may see stains from fingers, water, flowers, bookmarks, or time. Reading is never purely mental. The body reads too. The fingers turn pages. The eyes follow lines. The shoulders settle. The book rests in the lap, on a table, under a lamp, against a pillow, in a library cradle, or beside a cup of tea. Writing tools continue to evolve as well. Reed pens, brushes, quills, metal nibs, dip pens, fountain pens, pencils, typewriters, ballpoint pens, and keyboards all change the relationship between hand and mark. The Smithsonian describes collections that illustrate the evolution from drawing and dip pens to fountain pens and ballpoint pens. This does not mean we need to chase every modern writing instrument in detail tonight. That would be another whole quiet history. But a short glance forward helps us see the continuity. Every writing tool solves a problem. How to carry ink, how to make a line, how to write longer without dipping, how to keep the ink from spilling, how to make marks that dry quickly, how to write in a pocket notebook, how to write at a desk, how to write on a train, how to write in school. How to write cheaply enough that the tool can be everywhere. The ballpoint pen, for example, belongs to the 20th century world of portable everyday writing. Smithsonian notes June 10, 1943, as a patent filing date, connected with the ballpoint pen in its National Ballpoint Pen Day collection note. We do not need to linger there long, but the date reminds us how recent some ordinary tools are. A person in 1400 could not pull a ballpoint pen from a drawer. A person in 1000 could not open a school notebook made of cheap wood pulp paper. A person in 3000 BC could not buy a printed paperback. Every ordinary object has a date before which it would have seemed strange, impossible, rare, or magical. That is why material history is such a good antidote to assumption. It asks us to look at the desk and realize that nothing on it is neutral. The paper has a history. The ink has a history. The binding has a history. The pen has a history. The shelf has a history. Even the quiet habit of reading before sleep has a history shaped by light, leisure, literacy, privacy, beds, books, and the cost of pages. When we say paper, ink, and writing, we are not talking about three separate things. We are talking about an ecosystem of attention, a surface to receive, a substance to mark, a tool to move, a structure to preserve, a reader to wake the marks again. The book is where all of those meet. And now, after the tools and surfaces have gathered, we can let the story settle into its final quiet question. What does writing do to thought? A written thing survives only when the world allows it. That may sound obvious, but it is one of the most important facts in the history of writing. We do not possess the past evenly. We possess what survived, and survival depends on material, climate, accident, human care, and sometimes disaster. Clay survives differently from papyrus. Papyrus survives differently from parchment. Parchment survives differently from paper. Paper survives differently depending on its fibers, size, ink, storage, handling, and chemistry. Some writing lasts because it was cherished. Some lasts because it was forgotten in the right place. Some lasts because it burned just enough to harden clay. Some lasts because desert dryness slowed decay. Some lasts because a conservator opened a box, saw danger, and gave the object more time. This is why archives are full of both intention and accident. A royal library might preserve tablets deliberately. A dry cave might preserve manuscripts unexpectedly. A family trunk might preserve letters because no one had the heart to throw them away. A legal office might preserve documents because bureaucracy insisted. A book might survive because it was beautiful, expensive, sacred, useful, ignored, misfiled, or simply lucky. The Library of Congress describes important differences between older rag papers and later wood pulp papers. Before the mid-19th century, Western paper was generally made from cotton and linen rags. Those fibers could make strong, durable paper. Starting in the mid-19th century, wood became a major raw material for paper production, but mechanical wood pulp can leave lignin and shorter fibers in the sheet, contributing to acidity and brittleness over time. That gives us a useful way to look at an old page. Not all old paper is weak, not all newer paper is strong. A sheet from the 18th century may be in better condition than a newspaper from the 20th. The difference may lie in fibers and chemistry. An old rag paper sheet can feel surprisingly alive in the hand. It may be flexible, slightly textured, and strong. A cheap acidic sheet may be yellow, brittle, and eager to crack. Both are paper, but they age differently. Carbon ink may sit in one relationship with the surface. Iron gall ink may enter another. Printing ink behaves differently from writing ink. Pigments, dyes, binders, oils, acids, humidity, and light all become part of the object's life. A page does not stop changing when the writer stops writing. It continues to live chemically, quietly, slowly, usually too slowly for a person to notice in a single evening. But over decades and centuries, the change becomes visible. Edges darken, paper cockles, ink fades. Bindings loosen, leather powders, glue dries. Pages fox with brown spots, corners round from handling, margins collect fingerprints. Conservation is the art of listening to those changes. A conservator asks what the object is made of, what has happened to it, and what it needs now. Should it be humidified? Should it be flattened? Should it be mended? Should it be boxed? Should it be digitized? Should handling be limited? Should light exposure be reduced? Preservation is not the same as making an object new. Often, the goal is not to erase age. The goal is to slow damage while respecting the object. That is a beautiful ethic. Let the thing be old, let it carry its history, but help it survive. This is especially important because writing is often unique. A printed book may have other copies, though not always. A handwritten letter may not. A diary may be the only one. A marginal note may exist in a single hand on a single page in a single book. If that object is lost, the specific contact is lost with it. The page is not only information. It is evidence of presence. Someone leaned over it. Someone touched it. Someone chose these words. Someone corrected this line. Someone folded this corner. Someone placed a flower between these leaves. Someone underlined a sentence. Someone wrote a name on the inside cover. These small marks can become tender because they were not always meant for history. They were meant for use. And yet use is often what makes an object meaningful. A pristine book can be beautiful. A used book can be intimate. Ware tells us that the object lived with people. That does not mean damage is good exactly. It means that damage and meaning often arrive together. A crease may mark carelessness, but it may also mark a favorite page. A stain may be an accident, but it may also place the book at a table, in a kitchen, beside a cup, inside a life. For sleep, this can become a gentle thought. We are all made of materials that change. The page changes. The ink changes. The reader changes. Preservation is not refusal of time. It is kindness inside time. The history of writing therefore ends, not with a finished object, but with care. Someone makes the page, someone writes the line, someone reads it, someone saves it, someone repairs it, someone catalogs it, someone brings it out under soft light and reads again. The mark keeps sleeping and waking, sleeping and waking. That rhythm belongs to libraries, archives, bookshelves, and bedside tables. And now, after surfaces, inks, tools, bindings, machines, and preservation, we can let the story settle into its final quiet question. What does writing do to thought? By now, we have moved through thousands of years, from southern Mesopotamian clay tablets around 3100 to 2900 BC, to Egyptian papyrus rolls known from around 2900 BC, and written papyri from around 2500 BC, to Ashurbanipal's royal tablet library at Nineveh in the 7th century BC. To the later papyrus-making description given by Pliny around AD 77 to 79. To Chinese paper, and the careful tradition around Kai Lun in AD 105, with earlier evidence kept in view. To the roll to codex transition across the first few centuries AD, and to parchment, animal hide prepared into a surface strong enough for manuscripts. To the wide use of paper in China by the 3rd century AD, to paper becoming important in the Arab world by around the 8th century AD. To the Diamond Sutra in AD 868, the world's earliest dated printed book, according to the International Dunhuang Program and British Library. To Bisheng's movable type between AD 1041 and 1048. To paper becoming widely used in Europe from the 12th century onward. To iron gall ink, serving as a primary Western writing ink from the 12th through the 19th centuries. To Gutenberg's Bible in Mainz in 1454 and 1455. To Nicolas Louis Robert's paper machine prototype in 1798, its patent dated January 18, 1799, and the later paper machine improvements associated with England, Gamble, the Fourdriniers, and Donkin in the early 19th century. To the mid-19th century shift from rag paper toward wood pulp paper, and the newspapers, notebooks, and quiet paper world that came to surround modern life. That is a long journey for something as thin as a page, but perhaps thin things can carry enormous weight. The philosophy of writing begins with a simple fact. The mind moves, and the page waits. A thought is quick. It flickers. It arrives while walking, eating, counting, praying, planning, grieving, studying, or lying awake in the dark. If no one speaks it, remembers it, or writes it, it may pass away. Writing gives that thought a second place to live, not in the body, not in the breath, not only in memory, but in clay, papyrus, parchment, paper, ink, type, or print. A written thought is not alive in the same way a speaking person is alive. It cannot answer every question. It cannot explain its own missing context. It can be misunderstood, copied badly, damaged, censored, hidden, burned, or lost. But it can also wait. That waiting is extraordinary. A clay tablet can wait in the ground. A papyrus can wait in desert dryness. A parchment codex can wait in a library. A printed book can wait on a shelf. A letter can wait in a box. Writing is patient in a way people are not. We sleep, we forget, we leave the room, we die. But a mark under the right conditions can remain. There is comfort in that, and also humility. Because writing does not truly defeat time. It negotiates with time. It asks time for a little more room. Please let this name last. Please let this count be remembered. Please let this story be copied. Please let this law be known. Please let this prayer be heard again. Please let this recipe feed someone later. Please let this poem find a reader. Please let this thought sleep on the page until morning. That is why paper and ink belong so naturally in a sleepy history. They are technologies of rest. They let the mind set something down. A person who writes before sleep often knows this feeling. A worry becomes a sentence. A task becomes a list. A memory becomes a line in a journal. Nothing may be solved exactly, but the thought is no longer floating loose. It has a place. The page receives it. The lamp can be turned down. In a library, this happens on a grander scale. Thousands or millions of thoughts have been set down and arranged. Some are loud in meaning but quiet in presence. The shelves stand still. The pages do not shout. The ink does not move. Yet the room is full of human attention. A library is not silent because nothing is happening. It is silent because so much has already happened. All those hands, all those marks, all those surfaces prepared for memory. Clay, papyrus, parchment, paper, soot, red earth, oat gall, iron, oil, pigment, reed stylus, brush, quill, pen, type, press. Every book is a meeting place for materials and minds, and now as this quiet history settles, we can let the materials fade gently back into rest. Imagine one page on the desk. No hurry. A dark line of ink, a soft lamp, a book closed nearby. Outside the room, time continues. Inside the page, a thought waits. And perhaps that is enough for tonight. The page can hold what needs holding. The ink can darken where it has darkened. The book can sleep on the table. And you can let your own thoughts grow softer, lighter, and slower, until they too find a quiet place to rest.